If you like hand sanding, have I got the project for you. I had some scrap Baltic birch plywood and 8/4 walnut that I wanted to use up. I decided I would use the plywood as a frame for some bandsaw boxes. So as I'm drawing up the frame, I know my pieces of walnut are a given size, and I can't make them any bigger than that. So I'm drawing those loops that are going to hold the boxes with that size in mind. And the idea was that the top one would be the smallest and the bottom one would be the biggest. To keep it from tipping over, there's another piece going across it, and that is held in place just by a lap joint. I then traced the inside of the loops onto some 1/4-inch plywood to make a template, and then extended those out into the shape of the bandsaw box. And those templates needed to fit very snugly to the frame. The bandsaw boxes are made up of 3 layers of the 8/4 walnut, and the middle layer has been planed down to the same thickness as the frame, and that gets cut to be the exact size of the template. I didn't have a flush trim bit that was long enough to do the whole thing in one pass, so I started with a top bearing flush trim, and then switched to a bottom bearing and flipped it over. That bottom bearing bit was really dull. Then I started working on the 2 outer pieces of the box. Those needed to be bigger, so I used a fender washer to offset away from the template. And I also needed to make sure that I was making mirror images. So I wanted the box to flare out from the frame. And I was originally thinking that I would just tilt the table on the bandsaw. And I thought it would look better if it was curved. So I went through my collection of router bits, and I have this vertical panel raising bit. And that would give me the curve that I wanted, but it doesn't have a bearing. It's designed to only be used in the router table with a fence. But I have this rabbiting bit with a set of bearings. The 2 largest bearings have a bushing that reduces the inside diameter, and without that bushing, they're a 1/2 inch, so they fit on the shaft. But since the bearing is on the bottom, that means I can't raise the bit up slowly into the workpiece. It's going to have to go full depth right from the beginning. So I just made a whole bunch of templates, each one being a little bit larger than the next one. So I could have used that larger bearing from the set to reduce the number of templates I needed, but then I would have had to take the bit out of the collet to change the bearing, and that would have changed the height. So I thought it was just easier to deal with the template. So the template is on the bottom with double-sided tape, and then I put a couple of dowels in a piece of wood to give me handles up above the workpiece to keep my hands well away from what was going on. Wanted no part of that. So I just worked my way through the 4 templates, and after the first pass on the last template, I raised the bit slightly and made a finishing pass. Then I sanded down the part the router bit didn't reach. Then I put a small round over on what will be the front. Then I glued the 3 layers together. Now that bearing was slightly larger than the diameter of the vertical panel bit, so that left a little bit of a shoulder from the 2 outside pieces to the inner piece. So that was a good thing for where the box is inside of the frame, because that shoulder covers up any gap that might be in between the box and the frame. But it's a bad thing for where it's sticking out outside of the frame. Normally it's a bad idea to try to clean up glue squeeze out before it dries, because you just end up spreading it around. But in this case, either it's going to be covered up by the frame, or it's going to be material that's going to get removed later. So in this case, it was easier just to get rid of it right away rather than have to deal with it later. You're going to have to take my word for it, but when I put the 3 boxes into the frame, it just didn't look right. For one thing, because I made the frame taper, the 2 upper boxes were touching each other, and then there was a big gap between the middle one and the bottom one. So it just didn't look good, and you couldn't see enough of the frame. It was just too crowded. So I decided to make the middle box a standalone piece. So I learned pretty quickly that Using the grinder in this orientation is a bad idea, because you end up digging holes into the parts that are sticking up on the side. And this just really takes some skill that I don't have yet. But I muddled through it, and the results were okay. So I think this is a good practice piece if you want to get into power sculpting. It's a small piece. You're not investing a lot of materials and a lot of work to get to a point where you start sculpting. So that middle piece was designed to sit in the frame, not on a table. So the shape of it sitting on the table just didn't look right. So I ended up going back to the bandsaw and cutting out the bottom. And I wasn't quite happy with that first cut. So while I was at the bandsaw, I took the opportunity to cut a curve into that front edge. And I'm still using the grinder like that, so I guess I didn't learn that very quickly. On the other two boxes, I had to mark where the frame ended. So now I've smartened up, and I'm using the grinder in the opposite direction. That left a ridge in the middle. I did come back with the grinder going a long way again, down the middle. I didn't get any footage of that. And then a lot of power sanding. Then I needed to mark to cut the drawer out, and I didn't have a washer that was big enough, so I made one. It didn't occur to me to use those bearings. Then we cut the drawer out, and do not want to screw up here. It's more important to keep a smooth curve than it is to stay on the line. After sanding the inside of the boxes, then I ran a 1/2-inch radius round over on the inside. And I stayed away from the very ends, because if anything bad is going to happen, that's where it's going to happen. And there's just no point in taking a risk, because I'm going to be shaping that area by hand. To shape those corners, I'm using a rasp, and I'm just working down to get a consistent thickness along that outer edge. And then I'll feather it back into the curve to make it look natural. So in real time, this was about 5 minutes per corner, and it becomes a lot easier if you have a good way of holding that without it coming flying loose every 30 seconds. Then once the boxes were shaped, I could figure out where I wanted to cut the end of the drawer. I had this long piece of figured walnut that I wanted to use for the drawer fronts. And it's big enough that I was going to be able to get all 3 drawer fronts out of that one piece. Then once that middle box became its own separate unit, I had another piece of walnut with a crack going through it. I thought that would be perfect for that. And it's a lot harder to find a use for that kind of a board. So to figure out the exact placement of where I wanted to cut those drawer fronts, it was easier to put the box on the board and then look through the box. Then you can see exactly what you're getting. And once you're happy, you can just slide the drawer back inside and then remove the box and trace around it. So then I needed to cut the front and back off of the drawers. And these are very round. And when you're cutting something round like that on the bandsaw, the cutting force is downwards and there's nothing underneath it supporting it. So it wants to flip it up out of your hand. So you need to be really careful with that kind of a cut. When the round part was facing backwards, I had my push stick, and I just had that wedged underneath to give it support. On the standalone box, that board was big enough that I was able to get another piece for the back that would match the front, even though it didn't have any figure in it. On the other two, I just replaced the front. Then I cut 2 more slices off of the middle so that the drawers would be inset slightly. So by the time you've cut and then sanded the inside of the box and the outside of the drawer, you've lost a fair bit of material, and the drawer just kind of sits with a big space on the top. What I usually do is put a piece of veneer on the inside of the box to prop it up a little bit. Since I was replacing the drawer fronts, I figured I could put a piece of veneer on the bottom of the drawer, and then that would be hidden by the new drawer front that would be bigger. So I thought that would look better. It ended up with some really nasty glue lines on the bottom, so I don't recommend doing this. If I had it to do over again, I would make the edge of the box that faces the open part of the box taller, so you just see solid wood when you're looking from the side, rather than seeing that opening. So I wanted the drawer fronts to be curved, and I have this big table edge bit, but I only wanted to use the outer part of the bit, not the inside, because that was going to be too steep. So I went back to that router bit set, and I guess those router bits are pretty standardized because they did fit on this. Now, this is really too large of a bit on too small of a workpiece. My hands are well up out of the way, and I'm using a start pin, so I felt I wasn't going to get injured doing this. The largest one, I was confident in doing it on its own. The two smaller ones, I took a piece of scrap and some double-sided tape, and I put them together so the sort of one acted as an outrigger for the other one, so it wouldn't tip over. Because as you're removing material, eventually there's only a little tiny bit of the flat part that's left. So I started on the back side. I did it in 3 passes, and everything was going fine until the last pass on the last part. So what happened there is I came off of the bearing, and then I got careless about getting back on the bearing, and it took a big chunk. But that did not deter me from flipping over and doing the front side, because I thought I had just been careless there. So I was really attentive and really careful and had a really good grip on the pieces, and everything went fine until, again, the last pass on the last part. I'm not really sure what happened, except that it grabbed and ripped it out of my hand. So fortunately, it didn't do as much damage on the front as on the back, but I did lose a little skin in the process. Not a big deal. I could say you should do this all with a rasp instead of the router bit, but I actually drew blood twice with the rasp, shaping those corners. So what are you going to do? So then it was time for hand sanding. Lots and lots of hand sanding. I spent about 4 hours hand sanding the 3 boxes. And I probably could have spent another 4 hours to get it closer to perfect. But it was good enough, and I had had enough. I decided it would be easier to attach the 2 boxes to the frame before finishing. So I decided I would add a dowel, and I didn't want to drill through the outside of the frame. I have some drill bits with a hex shank that I could use in an extension. And then there was some awkward flesh trimming. I didn't record any of the finishing. All I can say is, if you're going to do a wipe-on finish on this like me, you better bring your A-game to avoid any drips. I'm really happy with the results. The surface is definitely not perfectly smooth, especially where I was creating it from scratch with the grinder. I think that gives it a human touch. You're of course entitled to your own opinion about that. I do have several other Bandsaw Box videos. I put together a playlist with my videos, along with other YouTubers